Apple may have just made its most significant contribution to AI in the past 12 months and has nothing to do with software or Siri. It's actually a paper that they published in the past couple of weeks called The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity. And so I dove deep into this paper. It was making the round, so you might have seen it already, but I think a lot of people missed out on some nuance throughout. But overall, there is a lot of really interesting information here studying essentially reasoning models. And so let's dive into it. So first, I'll get myself out of the way a little. Great, that's cool. So basically, how it started off, they developed a new set of tests. So rather than doing like typical data sets and benchmarks, they created their own puzzles. The reason that they did this was they thought that models have seen those benchmarks so much that they are going to be particularly good at solving them, and it's not reflective of how smart they are. They've just seen it over and over and over again, and so that they will be just trained to do really well on those benchmarks. And on top of that, those benchmarks don't allow you to like shift up and down the difficulty of a given problem. And you can't like make a math problem harder. It is that problem of itself, but you can't like twist up the difficulty dial. So they created 4 puzzles. You might be familiar with a couple. The Tower of Hanoi, I think, is probably the most popular one, where you have all these rings and you need to get them all to the end in some sequential fashion. And you can see these are examples of puzzles that are not very popular, so not likely to be like over exposed in the training data. And you can turn up the difficulty easy. So instead of having 3 rungs, you could have 4, 5, 6, whatever that might be. So again, better complexity, not a lot of contamination risk, and there's algorithmic solutions. There's a known answer, a known happy path. And so they tested these across. The big thing they wanted to get to here was, okay, how good are these reasoning models actually when we test them on things that aren't benchmarks? And so they tested models that had a reasoning and non-reasoning counterpart. So in this case, it was Claude 3.7 Sonnet Thinking and then Claude 3.7 Sonnet. And then they did DeepSeek R1 versus DeepSeek V3. And so we'll zoom in a little bit on this. Cool. So what you'll see is that like in the beginning, even just focusing on this Tower of Hanoi for Claude, it's kind of a similar shape when you look elsewhere as well. But you'll see for the complexity and the number of disks, for 1, 2, and 3, it's basically the same. And that's 3 different levels. It's basically the same level of accuracy for both the reasoning and the non-reasoning models. Then in the middle here, reasoning models, so this blue line outperforms the non-reasoning by a fair margin. But then interestingly, they both collapse essentially at the same point. Here it's 10 disks. For Block's World, again, you see similar performance, a drop where the reasoning model is much better, and then they kind of collapse at the same point. In some cases, like the non-reasoning is even above. Similar shape here, except you don't have the kind of same performance at the lower complexity, but immediate drop at the same level. And it's kind of the same across all the graphs. So generally at low complexity, the non-reasoning models win in that they are either performing above on the same level or like very, very, very close. And so I think that's a win for the non-reasoning models. That's what you see in this kind of yellow portion here. There's no yellow here, I guess. In the medium, that's where the reasoning models win as the complexity increases. And then at the end, at the high complexity, they both collapse and they collapse at the same part. And so they they call this, actually this might have been me, the thinking curve. So basically, at a certain point, you see that drop. And so looking at this, each curve shows how many thinking tokens a reasoning model generated before committing to an answer. And you'll see at low complexity, the lines rise quickly. These chains of thought help the model double check itself, and yet the spend stays high. Then it plateaus, and then essentially at the high level, and we'll look at the graph again after you're looking at this. At the high level, as the accuracy starts to dive, the thinking token goes down as well. The model still has ample context to keep reasoning, but it simply produces less reasoning at that really high complexity level. And so let's do this again. So we'll just focus on this graph. So number of thinking tokens, again, we see the lines rise quickly. So what's interesting is like you'll know if you've used reasoning models, they will reason about like anything and everything. You tell it like 2 plus 2. There was like a tweet going around that said like, "Hi, my name's Sam Altman," and it reasoned for oh 03 or whatever. And when these newer reasoning models reason for like 5 minutes, so reasoning shoots up, hits a plateau, and then it slowly starts to decline. And this kind of aligns with where the performance drops off as well to a degree, right? As we see this flat line, that's where you see the decline to start to happen. And we see it really across a bunch of different of the games and with the different models as well. Up, plateau, degrade. So it's interesting as the task grows harder, reasoning models initially will spend more time thinking, um, and then while it actually declines until a point, then it just drops off completely. It's kind of interesting aspect of the paper is around where the answers live in the chain of thought. Um, Basically wanted to see, okay, are the models like getting the right answer and then continuing thinking, or are they getting the wrong answer and then getting to the right answer through thinking? And what we kind of see, and again, if you use a reasoning model in ChatGPT or anywhere else, overthinking on easy puzzles or questions. And you could see this by the green mark appearing first here. So in Tower of Hanoi, you'll see the green mark appears first, so it should stop, but it keeps going, and it even generates some incorrect answers later on in its thought process. In the medium bend, as again, as it gets more complex and harder, the first ideas are wrong, but eventually it gets to the correct ones, and that's kind of what you would want from reasoning. It thinks through some options, eventually gets to one that's good, and beyond a certain point, it's just not going to get the correct answer. So this is that red part of the curve we saw before, where the complexity just makes the performance go to zero. And then maybe my favorite part was basically, so each one of these puzzles has a algorithm you can use to solve it. So there's like a happy path, there's an answer, and in these cases they passed the algorithm in the prompt to solve these problems. And so did that lead to better performance? No. And did it shift that kind of thinking cliff that we saw? No. So basically what we're looking at here is the default, so the normal, versus when the algorithm is literally given in the prompt of how to solve the problem. It's like the answer key to a degree. You can see it's basically the same in both cases. The default's like a little bit above here, like, excuse me, the algorithm is above here, the default is above here. So it's like generally pretty close. You could find directions where either is flipped, but performance stays the same, which I thought was really, really interesting. And yeah, as I mentioned here, the failure mode shifts from searching for a plan to mis-executing a known plan, skipping moves, duplicating them, halting early. Like these are all the failure modes that were discovered. But I think this really shows something deeper, that there is like a lot of unknowns about these reasoning models, and the more I read about them, the more I'm not super convinced that they perform a lot better on certain tasks. It would have been cool to see that actually ran with a non-reasoning model, but we don't have that. And this kind of harpens back, like this was what was ringing in my head was a recent video we made about more like alignment. And so it was about reasoning models don't always say what they think. This is an Anthropic paper. You can open that up. So this was a really fun read. Basically, what it came down to is Anthropic ran a bunch of tests. It basically showed that the models are not always faithful to whatever is in their reasoning. So they're not always going to say like the answers that are in like their thing process. The most like concrete showing of this was they gave the model a hint, and then it was like a multiple choice, and they gave them a hint, maybe that like C was probably the answer, and then in their reasoning it didn't show anything about them using the hint. You would expect it to say, oh, I've got the hint, so I'm going to do this, and it didn't do that. It kind of hid that to a degree. The model got a hint but doesn't acknowledge. So that's like a faithfulness issue, and it's hard to even know who these reasoning traces are for and how much they actually help the model get to a final answer, how much it is just like burning tokens, and whether that actually increases performance. And so we actually have another paper that we're going to be discussing soon that touches on all this, looking on reasoning models, how the increased thinking actually leads to better performance, or does having more tokens lead to assumptions that are incorrect, leading the model down the wrong direction. So wrapping up, on really easy problems and solutions, a non-reasoning model is definitely going to be a better fit. When it's in that kind of middle area, which of course this is all very context dependent, but reasoning models are going to perform well. They have like a use case for sure. And then what's interesting is they typically both collapse at the same level. What we call the thinking cliff, which is where reasoning tokens, they eventually just drop, and that aligns with the accuracy dropping as well. It's actually right before. So it's like, it's not like, correlation causation is tough to know here. So it's something I would say to run your own tests on. Even when given the algorithm, the reasoning models, got the same level of performance, which I think is really interesting. It feels like they just kind of go down these rabbit holes and they don't take as much of the context, but that's hard to tell. The non-faithfulness, just seems really relevant here, just because we're talking about the different ways that reasoning models maybe don't perform the way that we're being told, I think is really important to note. So again, maybe budget longer traces for like a medium complexity task and then skip them on easy tasks. And don't, you got to audit this stuff. You got to look at the traces. Like that will be really helpful in figuring out what's going on and what's wrong. And so that's it for today. Reasoning models, again, the more that info that comes out, the less confident I am in them. We'll have more on this soon, and we'll talk to you next time.